So the next element I'm going to focus on is the lamp, and the lamp is going to be kind of a primary focus for this entire scene. It'll probably be the most complex object in terms of the amount of parts that go into creating it. Now, we want to build a lamp that's in the style of a Luxo lamp. Now, I've included a couple of different desk lamp examples in here, just two, and of course you can always go out online and research your own examples, but for this part of the project, it's important that you have a lamp that's similar to this in that it has a lower arm and an upper arm, because we're going to explore hierarchy and parent-child relationships and some basic rigging. And the idea is that we want this lamp, once we model it, to function more or less like a lamp would in the real world, meaning that as I adjust one of the arms, the rest of the lamp moves with the object. And so I'm going to reference these two examples as I move forward, because I feel like there's enough information here to build a pretty complex lamp. Now, there's a few places where we're going to cheat because there's a really complex relationship with a couple of these parts with springs, and there's there's a couple different lower arms, and they pivot and rotate. So we won't get too complex, but we do want to include most of the details. We want to include things like an extension cord, the base, and the way that these parts mount towards each other. So I'm going to jump back into Cinema 4D, and in order to get this process started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the paper and the pen object, and I'm going to get them out of the way, because remember, we created those at the origin of our 3D space, and so as we create new objects, we kind of want to place our other objects around the table. And we're going to start off just like we did with the pen, in that we're going to start off with a reference object, and once we get this object to size and to scale, we're going to jump inside a new document and model from there. So what I'm starting off with is I'm starting off with a cylinder that's going to represent the base of my lamp. And by starting off with this cylinder, I can quickly just sort of eyeball the relationship of this cylinder to the rest of the table, and I feel like that's probably about right. It might even be a little big, but that's okay. I can always scale this thing down later. So I'll round off some of these values, and I'm looking at 129. Maybe I'll even bump this up to 150. Again, I'll scale this down later. So once I have this object roughly placed inside my scene, again, I haven't moved it along the X or the Z, I'll copy the object I have selected, I'll create a new document, and I'll paste that object into the scene. And now, I do have the ability, certain objects, and a cylinder is one of them, comes with a caps component. Now, the way that cylinders are constructed is that they have the main body object, and they have two caps, one on either end. And if we go into the caps tab of the cylinder, this will give me the ability to fillet the edges. And you can see that once I do that, it kind of rounds off the transition from the cap to the side of our cylinder. I can control the segmentation, and I can also control the radius, and so I'll reduce the radius just a bit so that we get kind of a sharper transition, and that gives me just about the shape that I want to get started with for the base of my lamp. Now I'll adjust the height a little bit, because I'll cheat this as well, and I'll kind of sink this down into the table. Maybe just a little bit. I'll assume there's going to be a little bit of an overlap, but I think this will get me started. Now, before I spend too much time modeling this, I'll do a quick file save, and I'll save this as Lamp01. And I anticipate that with the lamp project especially, I'll be versioning this because it is one of the most complicated items inside the scene. So I'm going to rough out just a few really quick parts, and I'll go back and name some of these objects here in just a bit. But I'm just roughing in a basic shape of how I expect the lamp arm to attach to the base. So I'm going to treat this base object that I just created, this cylinder object, I'll call this base. I'm going to leave the cylinder in place for now. I'm just going to let it be called cylinder, because I might decide to change that in just a bit. Now I'm going to jump back into my reference, and I'm going to take a look and just see how some of these lamps are connected. And I see that I kind of have this like cone or cylinder shape that comes up out of the base, and then it gets into this pretty complicated connection. Now, one of the things that's going to go a long way into convincing our users that we have a very convincing illustration is it's going to be in the details. And so I'm going to start to think about how this object or how this lamp is connected. And I'm going to think about some of the parts that would be included and really start to spend a lot of time thinking about the relationship from one part to the next. And I'm going to go into my spline menu, and I'm going to take this as an opportunity to explore this n-sided spline. It's just a polygon spline, so it's got multiple sides to it. And in the Object Manager, I'm going to take the sides down from 6 to 3. And so I get this triangle-looking shape. I'm also going to take the radius way down. And what I'm trying to do is to create a basic shape to connect to the bottom of this base lamp. So I'm thinking of kind of this bracket-style object. I'll just move this up just a little bit so we can get a better look at this. And I'll zoom in a bit. With the N-gon object selected, the N-gon spline, I'm going to turn rounded edges on. Now, I'm going to take that radius way down because it turned it into a circle. And what I'm looking for are these kind of rounded edges just like that. That looks pretty good. I'll continue to take them down because the size of this object feels still a little big. Now, that's going to be the shape that I'm looking for. Now, I do want to rotate this a little bit, but I'll worry about that in just a few minutes. What I want to do is I want to take this shape that I just created and I want to make it a three-dimensional shape by extruding it. Now, we've looked at extruding polygon objects in previous presentations, but this is a different style of extrusion. We'll look at this as a NURBS-based extrusion. There's an extrude NURBS here, and the extrude NURBS can be applied to any two-dimensional spline. So pretty much anything we find under the spline menu or anything we create using that spline menu, we can generate an extrude NURBS object, and as long as we put that n-sided spline inside the extrude NURBS object, you can see that it gets extruded. Now, by default, the extrude NURBS objects extrudes along the z-axis, and it just so happens that our polygon that we created, or our spline, is registered to xy. In other words, here's y and here's x, so its face is registered to xy, and therefore it's being extruded along the z-axis. And it just so happens if we look down the front viewport, that would be the flat face of our spline. That feels a little thick, so what I'll do is I'll select the extrude NURBS, and inside the extrude NURBS, the way that we extrude is based on this movement property. Currently, the movement along the x and y are set to 0. If we wanted to, for some reason, we could change those, and you can see how that affects the shape, but in this case, it's not at all what I want to do. I just want to take that z value down just a bit. And if, we're not seeing x, y, z being described here, but anytime you see 3 coordinates in a row, it's typically x is first, then y, and then z. Okay, just like we see here, x, y, and z. So I can make an assumption about which one's coming first. And I'll just take that down a bit. Now I have the basic shape, this basic bracket that I want. It maybe feels a little big, and so I can scale the entire thing down, and I'll do that by making sure that the extrude NURBS object is selected. And I could go to the scale to scale that down. Now, another thing I could do is I could actually go inside my spline object and just take the radius down. Because that extrusion is based on that spline shape that's inside there, I'll just take this down to about 60, and that's more or less what I'm looking for. Now, the only thing left to do, I think, is I want to rotate this, and I'll rotate this whole extrude, or maybe just the spline inside, just to get this to line up. I want one of these edges, I want this edge to either be sitting parallel with the base, or I want it, or I want the center to be kind of pointing up and down. So what I could do is if I select the n-sided spline, I could just rotate that spline, and I'm holding down the shift key to get this to snap. And once I see, in this case, it reaches -30, that seems like it's in the position that I want it to be in. That feels pretty good. So I'll go back to my extrude NURB object. And I did mention before, if I go back to the move tool, that a lot of times when you start messing with NURBS objects, you end up with your registration or your axes in kind of a very strange location. And the reason for that is that a lot of times we're generating this geometry based on a spline. So we'll take this spline and we'll move it up into position where we think it should go, or so that we can see it a little better. And then we generate an extrude NURBS object in this case. Now when I create that extrude NURBS, you can see that that NURBS exists at 0, 0, 0. The spline that we created was also at 0, 0 until we moved it along the y-axis. The minute that we nest a spline into the extrude NURBS, that parent or that extrude NURBS object, it uses its registration point as its point in space, and that can start to complicate things, particularly when you start to rotate things. Things rotate around that center point. Now, I'm just going to delete that extrude NURBS that I've created. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we can fix this. One way is to simply go into the spline object and just make sure that it's at 0, 0, 0 along the X, Y, and Z before we start the extrusion. We could also do it after the fact. So in other words, if I select the extrude NURBS object, and I can see that it's floating up here at 100, I could just zero that back out. When I do that, you see that its axis moves as well. Now I'll just lift that back up and out of the way. When I look inside this spline object, it's actually using its parent as its own registration point. What I mean by that is that it says it's 144 centimeters up on the y-axis, but in reality, if I zero this value out down to 0, you might be left scratching your head and wondering why that didn't move down to the center of this base. And that's because its origin, its 0, 0, 0, according to X, Y, and Z, is the center of this parent object. Okay, so when I set this spline to all zeros, it registers to the center of the space. Now, the only other glitch that we have now is that our axes are pointing off in a couple of different directions, and there's a couple of different ways that we can fix that. You can see that we have a rotation of negative 30, and I wanted that negative 30 because I wanted this bracket to be able to attach down here at the base of the spine, of the out the spline. Now, if I were to set this back to 0 or 30, that ends up putting this bracket in kind of this this position that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So what I can do is make sure that I've selected the spline, and then I rotate the actual spline to the position that I want, which was negative 30. And then you'll notice that when I select the parent object, it uses the registration point and the axes for the parent object, which we didn't change, we didn't rotate. So I have this bracket standing straight up and down. Now, that was only kind of half of what I wanted to do. It feels a little big, but the idea is that I kind of want to slide this thing over a little bit. I'll move it down just a bit as well. And I'm going to use this as the bracket that attaches to the base of the lamp. Now, before I get too far into thinking how this thing goes together, I want to do just a real quick rough wireframe of my lamp object. And so I'll start with a cube, and I want to use this cube kind of as the framework for the lamp. So I'm just going to make these X and Z values fairly small. That seems a little too big. I'll take them down to maybe 15. And yet I'll make it much taller. Maybe I'll go 400 based on the scale that I'm looking at. Now that feels pretty good. I'll move that up. Now the plan eventually will be to have two arms. They'll attach this little triangular bracket just the way that I had made it. I'll make a real quick duplicate just for reference and move it over there, and then I'll take a copy of this bracket and flip it around and attach it to the top. And all of those parts will combine to make the lower arm of the lamp. Now this is where we get into the details, the design process, and it's really all in the details here. And so I'm not going to share the entire workflow at this point. I'm not going to over design every piece, so I will jump forward a little bit, but I'll focus on the important stuff. And one of the things that I think is critical to the design here is that I really want, every time I have an attachment, I want to think about, as this lamp has been manufactured, how are these parts connecting? Because it's going to be much more compelling and much more convincing if we don't just stick a bunch of parts together, but think, okay, well, this is, a structural piece, and there should be some kind of bolt or screw that goes and attaches this bracket to this arm. And so what I'll do is I'll start to develop those little details. And I could get started and use a real quick combination of a couple different shapes to create a screw head and then just stick it against this object. And to demonstrate this point, I'll jump into a new project just to experiment with a tool set. And the tool set that I want to share with you is just to the right of the the NURBS menu, just to the right, we have these different generators. And we have things like an array object, and the one that I want to focus on is this bool object. Now, a bool is an additive or a subtractive process. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a cube, and I'll create a sphere. And I'll just move the sphere kind of off to the side, but I'll let these two objects overlap with each other. And if you have two three-dimensional objects and you generate a bool object, if I drag both of those objects into the bool, you can see that one subtracts from the other. So you can create some pretty complicated shapes. And if I want the opposite to be true, so in other words, if I want the sphere to subtract from the cube, what I could do is just flip these around in terms of their hierarchy. So I'll move the cube up first, and now when I look, I'm carving out the sphere from the cube. So the hierarchy does play an important role here, which one comes first. In the case of the bool, we have the base shape and then we have the subtract shape. And of course we can change those just by clicking and dragging inside the hierarchy. And I think I could use this technique. I can use this technique to create something that kind of looks like a screw head. So I'll just turn the bool off so we can see this a little bit more clearly. I'll take the cube object, and I'm just going to make its X size a little bit smaller, and I'll drag this and change its position so we can see this from the front. And then if I turn that bool back on, you can see that what I'm left with is something that looks pretty much like a screw head. Okay, and that's the thing that I'll end up using and attach to my lamp in various places to make it look like these things are really attached. So that's the technique. I'll close that window without saving, and I'll do that pretty often. If I want to figure out how a tool works, I'll do that in a new document or a new project file so that I don't get distracted with everything that's in this space. But I'll take this and I'll make that much smaller. Let's see, that feels about right. I think I like that. I'll make a cube, and the cube should be much smaller as well. So I'll make that, let's say, 10 in all directions. And I'll move that up just a bit. I'll tap the S key to zoom in, and I'll do that same trick. Just kind of line those up. I'll pull that square off towards the front. There we go. And I'll click and hold on this generator menu next to NURBS, and I'll choose the bool object, and I'll take the sphere and the cube and I'll throw those into the bool object. Now, I obviously had those reversed. I didn't want to subtract the sphere from the cube, so I'll take that sphere and I'll just move it up until I see the arrow pointing to the left, but it's above the cube and under the bool, and when I release it, there we go. That's exactly what I wanted. So I'll call this will be my screw head, and it'll be easy to track and move that object around. Now, I run into the same issue that I ran into before, which is that because these two objects end up inside of a group, you can see that the objects have different coordinates inside this world, but then when I select the screw head, which is actually the bool object, you can see that its position is at 0, 0, 0. So I have two choices. I could change the position of the sphere in the cube. I could zero out both of their coordinates and then kind of reset that relationship between the two. Alternatively, what I could do is I could go back to the screw head, and I could move its axis independent of the object. And the way that we would do that is there's this little tool over here. It's just above this magnet icon. It says Enable Axis. And what that does is in most cases, it will break the axis free, and allow us to move that axis independent of whatever its parent and child objects are. There are a few exceptions. And it's a toggle button, and so once I get that roughly in place, and if I wanted to be really precise, I would look at this through the front viewport. I'll tap the S key to zoom in, and now I get a real clear sense of what this looks like. I'll just do a quick shading line so you can see this a little bit more clearly. And now if I lift that axis up, I'm really just looking for that red axis will be a great visual guide to intersect with the center of that sphere. And now I know that that is more or less just right in the center of that shape. That Use Axis tool is a toggle button, so I'll click it again to turn it off, and now when I move, the object moves with its axis. Now that's a very important thing that we'll start to leverage in this project, particularly when we start changing the registration points or the rotation points of the arms of the lamp. Well, I've made it, all the while I've been very cognizant of the fact that I have not moved these objects along the X or the Z space, with the exception of, this arm of the lamp to kind of move the other version over just to kind of rough it out to get a sense of what I'm looking at. And also the intersecting cube for my sphere when I wanted to create my screw head. And the reason for that is that, at this point, this object, if I'm still just moving it up, it has a 0 on the X and a 0 along the Z, and so I have a very clear idea of where these objects exist. So now I'm going to start to move things around a little bit. I'm just going to move the my screw head around, and I'll probably want to zoom in and be a little bit more precise about this. But you can start to see that I can just attach that point there. I'll make a quick copy and paste, and I get a duplicate. And now I know that this looks like it's lined up pretty well. I could look at it from the side view, and it's actually sticking out quite a bit. So let me get rid of that first screw head that I copied. I'll go back to the original, and I'll take a closer look at this. I'll zoom in, and I'll set that back into this bracket just a little bit more, and that's really more what I wanted. And now what I can do is I'll copy and paste, and I'll take that second instance of the screw head that I just created, and I'll move that and restrict its motion to the Y and the X axis. And I can do that by grabbing onto the blue right angle here. And what the right angle does is it's blue because it corresponds to the Z axis, and it means that you can move it along any axis but Z. And the perspective viewport, that can be very handy to move it and restrict it to a two-dimensional plane. And that looks pretty good. I'll be really precise about this again and jump into the front view. I'll maximize this view for a moment, and I'll just zoom out. I'll grab that screw head, and that actually looks just about to be where I want it, right about there. That's pretty good. So I'm just kind of looking at this line. I'm just really, I don't have to be super precise, but it feels like that should move down a little bit to kind of follow that curve there of that bracket. So again, with this project, it's going to be a lot of it's going to be in the details, and I don't necessarily want you to follow exactly what I'm doing. I'm just sharing some of the workflow and some of the thought process that goes into creating these kinds of details. So, you can build your own variation, make sure that you're experimenting, but while referencing. Okay, so you definitely want to reference images of lamps, because if I wasn't looking at those examples of the lamps, I probably wouldn't have come up with this idea to create this kind of a bracket. And just by having this kind of detail inside my lamp, it's going to go a long way to make it look like this is a designed, this is a real thing. This is something that's been designed and manufactured. And so I'm just kind of taking a closer look at how these screws are lining up with the bracket itself. And it looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. Now, I was a little rough when I was placing, some of these other elements, but for now, I'm not going to over-design this. But I have a lot of elements that are now going into the creation of this arm, and I'm going to treat this bracket, the screw head, and everything else as pretty much just like one object. Okay, so I'm going to leave these cubes out of the equation, but I want the screw heads, and I also want this bracket. And I'll name this bracket, and I'll move it up near these other screw heads, And because I have all of these things just kind of, floating in space here, I'm going to treat that as one object. So I'll shift click to select it in the object manager, Option G to group it. And this will be the bracket with screws, just so I stay organized. And I'll take that bracket and I'll copy it and paste it. And I'll move that copy up. I'll go to rotate and I'll just kind of flip that around. I'll hold down the shift key so it snaps to 10-degree increments. And I'll go back to the move tool and I'll just move that and tuck that right there. Now I have bracket 1, bracket 2, and then I have these 2 cubes that act as the lower arm of the lamp. And so what I'll do is I'll take the brackets and all the cube objects and I'll group that and I'll call this lower arm. Now, by working this way, by continuing to build this up and then grouping these objects together, that'll enforce us to really stay organized. Now, I haven't even considered the backside of the lamp because I really want to finish it off with a duplicate set of these brackets. But for the sake of the demo, that's going to be something that I'll design off screen. This is, more or less what I'm going for. It feels maybe a little big relative to the base, so I'll probably scale it down and make these arms a little bit longer. But for the sake of the demo, I think I'm heading in the right direction. So in the next presentation, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the parent-child relationship and we'll start to build a hierarchy that creates a basic rig for our lamp. But we'll do that in the next presentation.